Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Paul Wright and I represent the Nautical Institute, but this is in fact a joint branch event with the Nautical Institute, the IMRS and RENA. It's very good to see you all here, and I understand there's about 20 in fact who are listening online. So again, welcome to our event this evening. I'm very privileged to introduce to you Dr. Andrew Eccleston. Dr. Andrew Eccleston has been a colleague of mine at the University of Plymouth for several years, and since retiring has continued his work in the area of weather forecasting. He'll explain his life, but he was a seafarer prior to in fact becoming an expert in the area of meteorology, and I think you'll find his talk interesting, stimulating, and I'm sure there'll be many questions to answer. So Andrew, I'm going to pass over to you to introduce yourself much more fully. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, this is the much delayed presentation about meteorology. This was originally scheduled for back in October sometime, but various reschedulings happened and various events got in the way, so I'm sorry I'm late. But hopefully it'll be worth the wait. And when I talk about weather, I like to actually talk about the weather that's actually happening outside at the time. However, what I'm going to do is just do the talk that I would have done if it had happened back in October, whenever it was. Although actually at the time, or around about that time, there was Storm Babbitt. Do you remember that? So that was quite a memorable event. So you'll actually see a little sort of mention of Babbitt as we go along. So I've called this How Modern Weather Forecasting Works. And the everybody uses weather information. I talk to lots of people in lots of different places all over the world and that about weather. And sometimes people are using weather information without actually understanding how it works. And I think that generally speaking, if you know a bit about how something works, you can make better use of the information you've got. And I do get very cross when people say they always get it wrong, which of course is actually rubbish. I mean, you're professional people, you'll know that you very often depend very much on the weather forecast, and it won't always go right, but most of the time it's very, very helpful and quite critical. So it's How Modern Weather Forecasting Works. That's the title I've given there. So I'm not going to teach you about weather, but I hope you'll find some interesting stuff that you didn't know about weather along the way. So yeah, that was my first ship. No, my last ship. Sorry, that was my last ship. That was a gas turbine powered container ship. Used an awful lot of fuel, and we just zoomed across the Atlantic down the east coast of America and back to Europe in a month. And that was back in the 1970s when I was first at sea. And I've never actually been on a merchant ship that was equipped with GPS. So that's how long ago that was. So I've still got my last sight book, which was Charleston in Carolina to Le Havre. And that was all done with the sextant. Of course, on the North Atlantic in the winter, you don't very often see anything, so that's a bit tricky. So that was my last ship. This is my last yacht. At the time I put this together, I still own that boat, but I have actually sold it now. There comes a time when you have to sort of stop sailing. But a lot of my weather interest at the moment is about sailing. In fact, I did the weather briefing for the tall ships race that went out of Falmouth this year, so I still have some engagement with the sailing community. That's another yacht that I've sailed. When I talk to younger audiences now, who the hell's Francis Chichester? Nobody. I said, well, go and look at the plaque on the hoe, but a lot of you will know exactly who Sir Francis Chichester was. And I never dreamt that one day I would sail his boat. So I actually sailed on 3 legs of the circumnavigation that celebrated the 40th anniversary of Chichester's first voyage. So that was quite an amazing adventure. The reason I got the trip was because they wanted a meteorologist. So I was the official meteorologist, which was really just the person that they could blame if the weather didn't turn out quite right. So I'm supposed to be retired, but I'm still quite busy. And I've been a member of the Royal Meteorological Society ever since I was at the university as a student back in the 1970s. Yes, 70s. And I'm now a chartered meteorologist. So you can be a chartered meteorologist in the way that you can be a chartered accountant or any other profession. And I actually get to go round and do accreditation interviews, people who actually want to be chartered meteorologists. And we have a sort of slightly lower level, which is called the registered meteorologist, which is for early career people. And we do that as a workplace assessment. So I actually went on the aircraft carrier on the Queen Elizabeth, because the lieutenant in charge of the weather department on the Queen Elizabeth wanted to be a registered meteorologist, so he got a visit from me. I'm also the secretary of PRIMET. PRIMET is a professional trade association that looks after the relationship between the private sector and the public sector in weather. Now, this is something that people don't very often realise, is that there's a lot of private sector weather now. I was just talking to somebody a moment ago who didn't know that the Met Office no longer does the BBC weather. A lot of people still think it's the Met Office that does that, but in fact it's a private sector company now called Meteo Group, which was originally a European group, but is now owned by an American company called DTN that nobody's ever heard of. So that's the private sector in weather, really muscling in on some quite big stuff. And there's a lot of politics in weather as well. I often say I work in the business and politics of weather, and people think that's a bit weird, isn't it all science? But no, there's actually a lot of business and politics, and you'll see how some of that comes out. And in Europe, we've had to do a lot of work with the politics of weather to get access to data for private sector companies. And we've been very successful in Europe. In fact, next week I'm going to Baltimore in America to the American conference, because they actually want to do the same thing in America as we've actually done in Europe, which is quite an interesting surprise. Now, linking all this to the marine environment, if you look at Marine Information Note 653, which talks about the oral examination for masters, officers' ratings, and those concerned with maritime training, the requirements for meteorological knowledge are a bit basic. Very basic. There's not a lot there, is there? So there's nothing there about, it talks about applying meteorological information, ability to interpret and use information, but I don't think there is much taught about how the weather forecast actually works. And it's useful to know something about that, so I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm talking about the old approach to weather forecasting. I'm going to talk about something called NWP. You may wonder what that is. The weather value chain, and how weather forecast is made. Different models. I think most people will know that there are different forecast models. A bit about that. The politics and business, and then I'm going to finish off with some examples that are applicable to marine navigation in 3 different ways. So there you are. There's the old approach. That's a very famous chart. That's the D-Day landing chart, and those of you who know your history a bit, you'll know that the weather forecast was crucial in determining when they went onto the beaches in Normandy. And of course, in those days, there were no satellites. A lot of that was guesswork, and it was sort of lucky guesswork. If you wanted to know what was happening up aloft, you had to go out in an aeroplane and perhaps survive being shot down or whatever, or you might have a weather ship out on the Atlantic. So very, very limited observations, and very, very tricky thing to do. But they pulled it off. That's the old approach. And that's all based around just plotting observations. Now, this is a modern chart here now, but this method is still valid. When I went to the Met Office College back in the 1980s, which is, 40 years ago now, we had to start the day by plotting all the station observations and then getting our 2B pencil and drawing in the isobars and all that kind of thing. And you've got a feel for the weather, which is really, really good. And it's rather like the transition we've gone through from paper charts to electronic charts. In meteorology, that transition happened 20 or so years ago for different reasons, but it's a rather interesting thing for me, having worked in both navigation and meteorology, to see the same thing happening in those 2 different contexts. But that's the sort of modern thing. That's windy. A lot of people know, a lot of people nodding. That is one of the best things on the web at the moment for weather. And this is obviously a different world altogether, isn't it? It's got colour in it, it's got lots of isobars, lots of numbers, all that kind of thing. So how does that come about? So that's what I'm going to talk about, how the modern weather forecast is made. So it's not people sitting in darkened rooms plotting stuff and with 2B pencils and drawing in lines and that. It's all flashing up on a screen like that. And in a way, again, it's rather like the transition from paper charts to electronic charts. You actually lose a little bit of the sort of real hardcore connection with what you're doing, because you're being presented with something which you then act on. So it's a different sort of paradigm to work in, which is quite interesting. We've got other stuff as well now, of course. That's the satellite image. This is Storm Babette, by the way. I did mention Babette. That's Babette, and that was a very low pressure there. Lots of wind, lots of tight isobars, and there's a satellite image that goes with it. And also we also have weather radar as well now, and that's interesting for me. When I worked in the Met Office for 4 years, I was actually working on the weather radar network in the 1980s when it was just being set up. It's now a fully operational system now. Whereas when I was first encountering it, it was just 4 radars, and it was all we were writing software trying to make it work. What does all this mean? This is windy. Along the bottom there, you see the bottom right-hand corner, ECMWF, UKV, GFS. These are all the different models. So one of the nice things with windy is you can actually look at the different models, and you can see if they're all agreeing or if there's any sort of difference. That's actually quite an important thing. And this is all because of numerical weather prediction. So if you look at Wikipedia and look for a definition of NWP, which is what we call it in the profession, numerical weather prediction, that's what you get. It's mathematical models of the atmosphere and oceans to predict the weather based on current weather. Now, it's all fairly straightforward. There's actually a book about it. It's a real thing. I've actually got a prop. I've got a book. It's... Yeah, it must be a very big book for 63.
Oh, there it is.
That's how dedicated I am. So the Nautical Institute have actually produced a book on numerical weather prediction, so it must be important. It's quite old now, but it's good stuff, written by an ex-RN guy. And so if you want to know more, you can read that. And anyway, it's all fairly straightforward. There it is. So now you know. So that's why you need a computer to do all this. And everybody knows the Met Office has the biggest computer, etc., etc. So it's all lots of complicated maths and so on. And I'm going to talk a bit about how that all works. So don't worry, we're not going to do any more maths. I just wanted to let you know it is a bit complicated. I find this quite a useful concept. This is from a publication by the World Bank. They're very interested in particularly weather disasters and so on. And this is the weather value chain. A value chain is a concept you can apply to lots of different scenarios, a business or whatever. And I mean, another way of thinking of it is a value chain is you start off with a farmer planting some seeds, and you go through various steps, and at the end of it, you've got a loaf of bread, which you can make a piece of toast. And so that's sort of the end of the value chain when you eat it. Goes on a bit further, but we don't need to talk about that. So the weather value chain looks like this. It starts off with ship observations, perhaps, or observations from a satellite, or from a ground station, and that's then used in numerical weather prediction, which you know all about now, and that's then used for generating forecasts. And it's people like the Met Office who run a big model, and also the ECMWF, the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. They used to be based in Reading. Unfortunately, Brexit got in the way, so there's the politics of weather for you. So that's all now in Bonn and Milan, whereas it used to be in Reading, next to where the Met Office used to be in Bracknell. The next part of the value chain is to issue warnings, and a good example of that is the shipping forecast. There are other types of warnings. Tailored services is now you're starting to sort of draw more value out of the weather information, and that might be a ship routing service. And the final stage in this value chain here is where you actually integrate the weather information with the business itself. And that might be happening, it might be happening already in autonomous vessels for all I know, but that would be an area where that could happen. So the weather value chain is quite an interesting concept in the modern weather world. Also a publication from the World Bank was a document called The Power of Partnership, which is actually talking about the partnership between the private sector and the public sector in weather. And there are lots of different evaluations of different parts of the world. This is comparing the USA and the UK. It's a rather complicated diagram. There are different colours there, but the two colours to look at are the light blue here, which is where the public sector is operating, and the orange area, which is where the private sector is operating. And one of the differences you can see is in the USA, the private sector has much greater participation in the weather value chain than in the UK. So in the UK, you've got a few small weather companies, which are mostly being bought up by the large American companies, like mine was back in the 1990s. Big difference in the way the market in the USA operates compared to the UK, and that's again to do with the politics of weather, because the Met Office competes commercially for weather. There are some countries in Europe where they're not allowed to do that by their government. There are some countries in Europe where they try to ban the private sector from being involved in weather altogether, and that's a very interesting tapestry across Europe. But in the USA, for many, many years, the publicly funded weather forecast information has all been publicly available. It seems logical, doesn't it, that if the public have paid for some data, the public should be able to have access to it, including a private sector company who might be able to provide a high value product, which is different to what the Met Office provides. So that's a bit about the business and politics of weather. There are lots of different sources of weather information. There are national weather services. Every country has its own national weather service, and they are all part of the World Meteorological Organization, which is headquartered in Geneva, and that defines a lot of the communication protocols, a lot of the sort of training requirements, and it helps the more developed countries help the less developed countries, that kind of thing. Does a lot of very good work. And so we have the Met Office, ECMWF, which is a Europe. Well, actually, ECMWF is an international project. It's not actually a European project. So the UK is actually part of ECMWF, but obviously the politics have reshaped that a bit. Météo France is the French, and there's the Deutsche Wetterdienst, and then NOAA, of course, is the American National Weather Service. In the mix, you've also got government agencies. An example would be the MCA, which we're all familiar with, of course, the BBC, which is our public broadcaster, and then you've got private companies. And who uses XC weather? People like XC weather, don't you? I'll mention something about them later. And there are various interconnections between them. So Météo France and the American National Weather Service have open data, so they actually make their forecast data freely available to anybody who can use it. The Met Office provides the MCA with the shipping forecast, so the MCA is the client for the the shipping forecast from the Met Office. But then, as I mentioned earlier, a company called Meteor Group actually does the BBC. The Met Office lost that contract some years ago. They lost it in two stages. First of all, they didn't really have the system technology that you need. TV weather, everybody knows what TV weather is. You sit at home and you watch it. But there are three things you need to do TV weather. You need a weather forecast. You need a presenter, which is either a man with a pointed stick or a good-looking lady, depending on what the broadcaster wants. But you also need a system to deliver that. And the TV company will usually want to have a website which looks just like you've got on screen, all that kind of thing. And that needs a lot of technology. And that actually is the most difficult part. Funnily enough, the weather forecast is the easiest bit.
Is the National Oceanography Centre interact with many of those
Yes, not directly, I don't think. There's certainly close connections with the Met Office. Yeah. So there are lots of interconnections. Now, ECMWF and the Met Office are now actually starting to release their data more openly. That's a recent change. So, how the weather forecast is made. So, this is obviously a gross oversimplification, and all those squiggly equations I showed you earlier on are sort of at the heart of this. But broadly speaking, what you need to make a forecast is you need a lot of observations, you need some maths and physics, and you need some other data as well. So you start off by trying to understand what the weather system is doing all over the world to begin with. You then use all those clever equations to say, well, if that's what it's like now, what it's going to be like in an hour's time, and so on and so forth. And that will all be constrained by the topography. So, for example, the Himalayas, the Rockies, the difference between the oceans and the land, that all affects the weather, so that all has to be taken into account. And you feed all that into a computer, you press a button and you get a weather forecast out. And the weather forecast comes out as a lot of binary numbers, and the format for that is called GRIB, gridded binary, and that's a WMO protocol. And if you talk to ocean racing sailors, which I do from time to time, they will talk about getting their GRIBs. That means they've got a transmission of the forecast model data, which they could then put into their routing algorithms to optimize their performance. And if they're racing around the world, as people do now, that's really, really important stuff. But that's also now used by cruising sailors. So I'll show you an example of how all that works later. So this is binary data that pours out of the computer, huge volumes of it, and that can then be used to produce automated products, like weather charts, the kind of thing that you see on Windy. Windy, everything you see on Windy is done by computer. There are no human hands sort of deciding where the isobars go or anything like that. But some stuff goes through an operational meteorologist, so there is hands-on. And the shipping forecast is an example of that. So there is a desk in the operations room in Exeter now, and there is somebody sitting in front of a screen, and they've got all the data, and they actually have to produce the shipping forecast. And the shipping forecast, it's a national treasure, isn't it? People write poems about it and all that kind of stuff. But it's really very crude, isn't it? I always think it's a bit like if you decided you were going to get into DIY, seriously. You would go into B&Q and you come out with a small hammer and you didn't notice all the power tools. So Windy is like a sort of power tool, and the shipping forecast is a bit like a small hammer. However, it is much revered, and of course in the absence of any other information, it might be quite vital. It's important to understand that this whole thing has to happen in 3 dimensions. So the atmosphere is divided up into many, many little cubes, and the forecast has to be worked out for every point at the intersection of all cubes. That's why so all those equations are all being solved many, many times over for many hours and days ahead over a vast volume. So that's why you need a big computer. Now, why is the weather forecast always wrong? It's certainly it's a truism, really, that the weather forecast is always wrong because it's bloody difficult to get it exactly right. So we've got used to having what are called deterministic forecasts. So if the man on the telly says it's going to be 12 degrees tomorrow, you think, it's going to be 12 degrees. But you'll know very often it isn't. It's 11 or it's 13 or whatever. And that's because it's very, very difficult to forecast precisely what's going to happen because it's a very, very complex, very large system full of lots and lots of energy. And in recent years, the meteorological profession has sort of understood that you can't be precise about it, but we've actually leveraged the variability in weather to produce more valuable products, and I'll explain how that works. So the problem is that you'll never have enough observations. If you want a perfect understanding of exactly what the whole atmosphere is doing at any one time, you have to have an enormous number of observations. If you think about it, if you're interested in rainfall, when you walk down the street, you'd be tripping over rain gauges if you had a very high density of observations. So you'll never have enough observations to define everything perfectly. So that's the first part of the problem. The maths and the physics, we can't actually model all the small interactions. So literally, there's this thing about the butterfly's wings in Asia and whatever. So it's true, isn't it? I mean, I've just waved my arm now, and I have actually affected the atmosphere in a very, very minor way, which no one's going to bother about. But that's another truism. So that's another way that errors can be introduced. Then there's also the other data, the topography. Have you got enough detail? So if you go sailing in Plymouth Sound, you get to know where the weather changes a bit. When you go past Jenny Cliff and you go past into the Corsan Bay and the wind swirls round, and that's all because of the topography. So if you haven't got the topography modelled on a very, very fine level of detail, there'll be small variations in the wind flow. I actually interviewed somebody for accreditation some years ago at the Met Office in Exeter, and he'd been based at Gibraltar, and he was there in the days before the Rock of Gibraltar was actually included in the modelling that the Met Office did. So the local people had to have a way of locally figuring out what the wind was going to do to take account of the Rock of Gibraltar, because it wasn't actually included in the model, and they actually had an empirical method for doing that. Then the other thing is interpretation by the end user, and that can sometimes go awry, and you get that sort of crap. So this is rather, the sort of extreme end of things, obviously, but that's a problem. So people get a weather forecast, but they don't actually use it properly. They decide to do that, and so on and so forth. And that's all rather garish. But look at this. This is an interesting one. The Herald. Ferry leaving Plymouth, France, delayed by Storm Gertrude. That's a nice local story, isn't it? Look at the date on it. 2016, January the 2nd. It actually happened on the 29th of January. So the Met Office have this named storms, they call it. And the idea is to draw the attention of the public to a weather event that's going to be particularly nasty. But this has been hijacked now. So the Herald has decided it can decide whether it's Storm Gertrude. And it was wrong. So this is just to illustrate the end user has a role to play in this. If you don't use the weather information properly, you'll think the weather forecast is wrong. So that's just illustrating that. So that's the sort of state of the art at the moment, and this is the way it's going from sort of now forwards. The big advances have been the international exchange of data. So we now have data from all over the world to include in the model. Some areas are very data sparse, areas of Africa, across the oceans and so on. A lot of that is filled in by satellites. And of course you also get some political boundaries as well. So occasionally countries will stop sending information into the global data exchange, but that's pretty well covered now. The high performance computing has made a big difference as well. And every few years, in fact, the Met Office has got like £1 billion or something for its next generation of computers. But in fact, they're not actually going to buy a computer. They're not going to buy hardware. They're going to buy a service from Microsoft, and the data is going to be distributed by Amazon. So that's going to be fun, isn't it? Data assimilation. This is the methodology which is used to take in all those observations and create a uniform, sort of harmonised view of what the weather is doing all over the world. It's very difficult to integrate three-dimensional satellite imagery with surface observations, for example, but there are techniques for doing that, and it has to be done in 4 dimensions because it's the 3 dimensions of space, but there's also the dimension of time as well. So that is a whole area where there are rafts of people doing PhDs and things in data assimilation methods. Satellite sounding has made a huge difference as well. That's filling in a lot of the data gaps. And satellites can look down vertically through the atmosphere now and also look at wave patterns and determine what the surface wind is doing just by looking down at the wave patterns. And the latest thing is ensembles. Ensemble is like a choir singing together, and this has made quite a big sort of revolution in weather forecasting. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. Just an example now about the politics again. In Europe, this year there's a big revolution going on where there is now legislation which forces the national weather services to make their data openly available. So you no longer have the situation where a private weather company sets up to deliver some new and unique product that can't actually get access to the data that they need to do it because the government won't let them have it. That's still the case in the UK, although that's changing, but over Europe there's now legislation that backs that up. So that's causing a whole lot of sort of changes in the marketplace. The different models, I've mentioned some of them. The American model is called the GFS. The UK has 2 models. That one does a sort of local area and the other does the whole globe. ECMWF, very, very good model. French have 2 models. And you see the difference is actually the grid length. Now I mentioned that it's a lot of little cubes all over the world, and obviously the more of those cubes you have, the more detail you can get in the weather. So if the grid length is very long, you don't get many data points. But if the grid point is very short, you've got a lot of data points over a small area. I'll illustrate that in a moment. Another one of the differences is the number of days ahead that you can forecast for. So routinely now, the global models are running for many, many days ahead. And the accuracy of weather forecasting out to 4 or 5 days is now very, very, very reliable. The final column there is where the data is freely available. Now, the green ticks are the ones where the data's been available for a long time. But the UK Met Office has now started to release the high-resolution UKV model, and that's actually available on Windy now, and that's really quite a breakthrough. That's only happened this year. And the ECMWF is also on a path to open data. The models don't always agree with each other, and that's because of some of the factors I talked about. The differences in data availability, errors in the mathematics, and so on and so forth. This is an illustration of the issue about grid length. So you'll recognise this area, and there are some little wind barbs there. Okay, that is the GFS 0.25 degree data set. That's what XE Weather uses. So if you're using a weather forecast from XE Weather to decide what the weather's going to be like in Plymouth Sound, it's some kind of interpolation of what's happening in between those points. It's still quite good, but if you look at so these are about 15 miles apart. So if you look at the French Rome model, which is a much higher resolution, you've got loads of data points. These are only just a few meters apart. Whether it actually delivers any benefit to you depends on a whole variety of other factors, but you've obviously got a better chance of getting a more detailed forecast for a particular location if you're using a high resolution model compared to a low resolution model. And there is a technique now, and you'll see this in one of the examples later on, where a high resolution limited area model is run inside a global model to generate more detail. Another question which is often asked is which model is the best? So it's an international sort of race to provide the best model. But it is generally agreed in the profession that the ECMWF model is the best. And this is an independent set of evaluations, and the red line is the ECMWF line. Hi, Andy. And this is the mean sea level pressure forecast for T plus 72 hours, so it's a few days ahead. And it wiggles around all over the place, but the red line is generally lower than all the other ones. The UKMO is not bad. Sometimes it actually beats the ECMWF. NCEP, that's actually the GFS, that's the American model. That's not so good. And sorry, that's the green one, and the black one is Météo France. But however you evaluate the accuracy of weather forecasting, the ECMWF model always comes out best overall. Not all the time, but overall it does. Another important thing about weather forecasting is that the error in the forecast will get larger as time goes by. So a weather forecast for 5 days ahead is probably going to be less accurate than a 4-day, 3-day, 2-day, etc. So this graph here, which is again an evaluation that's done comparing lots of different models, you'll see that the ECMWF model, this is for mean sea level pressure, that line is below all the others. So there is no debate in the profession about this. The ECMWF model is the best, and everyone is aspiring to do that. ECMWF will have a big presence at the American conference next week. This is a bit of a nautical flavour. So this is wave height forecast. So again, even for wave heights, the ECMWF model performs best. And they just have, it's a good example of cooperation, because for people from all over Europe, all the best people in Europe are working at ECMWF, and it's producing the best result. One of the reasons they had to leave Reading, of course, is because it's very difficult to get people from over there to come and work over here, because we said we don't like you people, and there are British people who've now had to move to Germany in order to carry on doing their science in ECMWF.
Sorry, what's the y-axis? Just an arrow.
Well, this is significant wave height. So this is just some error measurement. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what it is, but there are lots of examples like this. This includes a lot more. That's the Japanese, the Deutsche Wetterdienst, and so on. I guess that's New Zealand as well. There's an enormous volume of products out there. This is a hurricane. Now we're used to seeing these sort of diagrams. Occasionally, I think Mr. Trump actually modified one, didn't he, rather famously, when he didn't like the way it was going. But we're quite used to the fact that when forecasting a hurricane, we're not really quite sure where it's going to go. And this is the sort of critical thing. It goes through the Caribbean up the eastern seaboard. And you know, intuitively, you can appreciate that, can't you? It's very difficult to know where it's going to go next. And the further ahead you're trying to project, the bigger the error is likely to be. Now, this is really, really useful concept. Just as a little side issue, this was the Gulf of Mexico in August last year. And notice there are no boats just to the west of Florida there. And there's a reason for that. That was Hurricane Idalia. And the day after, there's a few boats there. So that's meteorology revealed through marine traffic, which I thought was quite interesting. So this is a technique that's used by people advising routing of ships. So hurricanes, you know, even to large ships, you know, are not a very pleasant sort of experience. And the term that's used for this is the spaghetti plot. So this is all the different possible routes that could be taken by a particular hurricane. And this is an expression of the uncertainty about what's going to happen. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Leads us on to this technique called ensembles, where you actually produce lots of different forecasts, acknowledging the fact that there's going to be an error anyway. But wouldn't it be interesting if if they were very wide apart, then you knew you were in a difficult situation, whereas if they're very close together, you could have a lot more confidence. It's a bit like when there's a football match coming up, on television they will have pundits, you know, who will give their opinions about what the result's going to be. And if you can imagine you don't normally get this, but if you had 10 football pundits all lined up, and you said, okay, we've got Manchester United versus Plymouth Argyle, what's the result going to be? Well, you know what you'd expect with that. If you said, okay, Manchester United versus, let's choose Nottingham Forest, you'd find, it'll be maybe 50-50. And so you don't know what the result's going to be, but you've got a better understanding of how reliable the answer is going to be. And that's what ensembles is about. Now here's an example of an ensemble forecast. And this is actually from the Met Office. And this is for the 10-metre wind gust in London over a period of a few days. And these are all different parameters in the forecast. But what you can see is at the beginning of the forecast period, everything's fairly closely in agreement. And as time goes by, everything becomes very chaotic and spread out. And there's actually a storm in the middle of it as well. And the methodology that's used here is that the model is run many times over, which is why you need a big, powerful computer. And each time you run the model, you make a small change in the starting position. You maybe alter a temperature here, or a wind, or some other parameter, and that will introduce a perturbation. And if, despite having created this difference, you still get a consistent result, you can be very confident about it. So what you're doing is kind of mimicking those latent problems about data assimilation and so on, as I mentioned earlier. And you're using that as a weapon to understand the likelihood of a particular result. And you see this now on the Met Office forecast. It's been there for a while. They talk about the probability of precipitation. The other day somebody was asking me about this, and if it says 70%, does that mean that 70% of Plymouth is going to get rain and the other 30% isn't? It doesn't mean that. It means that there's a very strong likelihood that you will get rain. It's not certain. If you see 90% or more, then you can be very confident. But if it's 50% or less, it just gives you, it's like a sort of risk assessment that runs alongside it. Yeah, that was a storm in the middle of it. Now, it's quite a complicated concept, and I quite like using ChatGPT. Does everybody like ChatGPT? Yeah, it's you've got to be cautious. You need to. It's gone a bit beyond being entertaining. It's actually quite useful now, I actually had a hip X-ray a little while ago, and I got the text of the readout on it, and it's all sort of full of medical stuff. So I put it through ChatGPT, and it said it's not too bad. You'll be right for a few more years, kind of thing. It starts with it just says, I'm not a medical expert, but this is what it means to me, and you should consult with professionals. They're very proper about the way they do it. But it's quite useful if you're trying to explain something complicated to ask ChatGPT what it makes of it. Oh, yeah, they've heard me. And so that's what it produced, very quickly, of course, and we don't need to read all that, but I thought this was a very good sentence here. This actually sums up what I've been saying in a roundabout sort of way. Ensemble forecasting has become an increasingly important tool for weather forecasters, as it allows them to better understand the range of possible outcomes and to communicate that uncertainty to the public. And that's a really, really good sentence. So when you see 7% chance of rain, don't think, oh, they can't make their mind up. What they're telling you is there's a pretty good chance it's going to rain. That's the sort of level of confidence we have in it, and that's based on a very sound scientific principle and a lot of careful calculation. So there's another logical question: could you use AI to do a weather forecast? And that's interesting. The answer is yes. And if you look at some recent papers on this, was something that came out in 2022. There's some real progress on this. But the interesting thing about this is, look, most of the authors on that paper are from NVIDIA, which is a big technology computer chip company. So AI is actually taking us away from meteorology into pure technology. There's another one here, which the main sort of movers in this are not actually meteorologists. They're actually technology people who are just used, because AI can do anything, can't it now? And there are some really, really good products coming out. And the ECMWF, if you Google ECMWF charts, you can spend several days looking at all the stuff that's coming out. And at the bottom of the pages, they've actually got these AI products, which are just pure AI weather forecasts. So none of this observations and that kind of rubbish. They've actually taken the 43 years of ECMWF forecasts, and they've used that as the learning set for an AI system which does weather forecasting. And it's scary because it's going to change a lot of things. So the current state of affairs, as far as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this area, but from what I've read, the accuracy you get for sort of broad scale weather forecast is pretty good. What it's missing so far is being able to do extremes and detail, but that will no doubt come. But the really, really interesting thing is it requires much less computing power. The learning is a huge challenge, but once you've learned it, you can actually do a global forecast on a much smaller scale hardware. And that's really interesting. So it's either going to mean that we can use much smaller computers, or it can mean that we can run more of these ensembles, so we can actually get even more detail in the ensemble forecast. So this is how this works out in the weather world, in the marine environment, for example. I've been using these kind of charts I do a lot of talks to sailing clubs, people who actually sail across oceans and across the Bay of Biscay and places like that. And when if you're sailing a small yacht across the Bay of Biscay, you've got to take that very, very seriously. And you need to know what the risk is you're taking. And these are charts that have been produced by the American Fleet Meteorology Center for many years now. And the different colours represent different probabilities of the wind speed at 10 metres, which if you're a sailor is, kind of near the top of your mast, wind exceeding 35 knots. And there you can see straight away that if you're going across Biscay at that time, you're likely to get a high probability of winds exceeding 35 knots, which if you're a small boat, that's a bit unpleasant. And there's the wave height. So all the different parameters are produced in these ensemble models. And of course, with lots of wind, you get big waves as well. The ECMWF charts are also coming out with these kind of products as well. Significant wave height probability greater than or equal to 6 meters, just in very easy to read colors. And there's a wind speed probability. So these are now quite widely available products. These are all publicly available product. Very useful to a sailor, but also people doing offshore operations and so on. So I'm going to finish with 3 examples of this sort of modern forecasting used in the marine environment. I'm going to look at a detailed forecast for an offshore operation, kindly provided by Gordon, who's not here this evening, and passage planning on a cargo vessel by an American ship router, and sailing a yacht passage across Biscay done by myself. This is something that Gordon sent me when he, some months ago, when I suggested doing this talk, and he's involved in the Celtic interconnector. Celtic interconnector, I guess it's really, that's some kind of offshore operation. And these are products which they're getting. If I zoom in a bit on that, you can see really quite detailed, hour by hour, information about wind, waves, swell, that you would need to have for an offshore operation with some perhaps critical operations going on. And this is produced by a company called StormGeo, which is a big private sector company in Europe, been around for a long time, do very good work. And when you read up on how they do this, you'll see a lot of the things I've been talking about reflected in their write-up. So they talk about global numerical prediction models. They mention ECMWF, and they also mention the GFS, the American thing. So they use all the models. So the problem with the amazing storm of 1987, the Michael Fish thing and all that kind of stuff, was in those days, the Middleton and Bracknell just looked at their own model. And that was an occasion when their model was wrong, but all the other ones were right. And that was a mistake they made. And so now everybody looks at all the models. And you come up with your own opinion. You assemble this row of pundits and you form a view. So they talk about ensemble models, and they talk about the range of possibilities. And then they also talk about a fine scale model running over a limited area. And they mention WRF. WRF is a model that was developed initially in America and is now very widely used. What you do is you take one of these global models, which has got a long grid length, and then you embed within that your own model, your own version of the WRF model, which you can put in extra topography, some new observations which the global model didn't have, and you can generally get more detail and possibly more accuracy as well. So that's the technique that StormGeo is using to provide very, very detailed spot forecasts for an operation offshore. This is an example of a voyage forecast. A company called Fleet Weather. This is interesting. They're an American company. Well, actually, they're British owned, but they operate out of America. And I've interviewed about 20 of their staff. The whole operation was set up by an ex-Navy guy, and he decided that he wanted all the people working in this ship routing organisation to have Royal Meteorological Society accreditation. So myself and another guy have been working through them, and it's really been very interesting. There are 2 or 3 of them haven't actually quite sort of got up to, it's a competency-based sort of qualification. But generally speaking, they're very good, and they're people who've just come out of university and they've learned about meteorology, and they're put through a course by these people at Fleet Weather, and they turn out some really amazing people, and they're actually directly advising ships on routing all over the world. And I always ask them, have you ever been on a big ship? And they say, oh, I went with my mum and dad on a cruise 20 years ago, but that's about as good as it gets. So none of them are actually mariners. But it's amazing the knowledge that they've got pumped into them, and they'll quite talk happily about parametric rolling and all sorts of stuff like that. And they obviously produce a very, very valued service. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business. And they communicate directly with ships, and they provide day-by-day weather forecasts. And they talk about ice and so on. In fact, that's the highest level. They have several different layers in their structure. And they start off at a junior level, and they get supervised and so on and so forth. And at the very top, it's the people doing the ice and formation, that kind of thing, which is one of the most sort of critical areas. And that always goes to the top of the pile. And the products they produce are, this particular example is not a very exciting one. I haven't got much of this material. This wasn't a particularly interesting one, but it shows you the scope of the advice that they're providing. and this is the message that goes to the ship. And they talk directly to the master on the ship through email and so on. And they recommend various routes and explain what the options are and what the advantages are, and produce a chart as well. So, in comparison to the time when I was at sea, you did it there's a hurricane coming kind of thing, and on the container ships we actually had a fax machine. You could get charts from what was the name of the no, not Bracknell, Northwood, sorry, that's right, yes. And that was interesting, but now, of course, there's an enormous amount of data, and you can't really expect people on ships who've got a lot of other things to worry about as well to analyse this sort of data. So there are guys ashore who are doing this for them and providing advice directly to them, and it clearly is of use. And they're doing all the oceanography as well, and taking account of the emission control zones, because that affects the economics of the voyage. So I've learned a lot from talking to these guys, and also about pirate areas as well, detouring and so on. So that all affects the economics of it, and that's all taken into account. Then finally, a channel crossing. So every March I do a talk at the Cruising Association headquarters in London to the Biscay section. And the first time I did it, which was some years ago, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do a weather routing for crossing Biscay tomorrow? So I I do all this stuff about weather and so on that I've gone through now. And I say, does anybody fancy going across Biscay tomorrow? And bear in mind, this is middle of March. And everybody says, oh, no, terrible. But every time I've done it, I've actually found there was a weather window, because you need about 3 or 4 days to get across Biscay. And if you use all the data and you proceed with caution, it's surprising what you can do, even in March, across Biscay. And so on this particular occasion, it happened to be my birthday, the 18th of October. I was at the one of the other sections of the Cruising Association, and it was in Poole, and it was when Storm Babbitt was going through. So I did my usual thing. I said, well, let's plan a passage for tomorrow. And everybody had seen the shipping forecast, which of course was looking rather fruity. So I wasn't really seriously suggesting that people should do a passage across the channel at that day, but wouldn't it be interesting to see what the consequences would be? And I was I've got an Android app which runs on a Samsung tablet, and I got this several years ago, and there's a free version, and then there was a deluxe version which ran, with the free version you could only do a routing for 2 days, I think, but with the deluxe version, which I paid €40 for, it's done by a French guy, you could actually do anywhere in the world for any length of voyage. The latest thing is called SailGrib, and it now costs £17.99, so I think they've sort of commercialised it and even reduced the price. This is a wonderful tool. So it will take in the grid data, they handle all that sort of upstream part of it, and that includes all the ECMWF data, the GFS data, the UKV data. So this was actually the first time that I've been able to use Met Office forecast data to talk to sailors. And I've done years and years of it and never actually been able to use Met Office data. I always had to give an excuse why I was using French data or American data. And, Helen MacArthur was sort of going around the world using American and French data, and she was crazy. Anyway, so this is what it was at the start of the voyage. Start of the day, the wind was easterly, 25 to 30 knots, and you can see that there. And we're going to do a passage from Poole to Cherbourg, which is sort of the sort of thing that the guys that I was talking to would be doing. And there you can see the rum line there, which was the sort of first stab at how we were going to do it. But bearing in mind we're sailing, so you've got to think about what the wind's doing. And during the course of the day, the wind veers and increases in strength, and it all gets a bit hairy. And then later on, it gets even worse. We don't actually get any little triangles, but there's a lot of feathers. By the evening, we've now got a southwesterly gale. So I'm not suggesting seriously you do this, but if you'd run the routing for it, this is what you get. You find that you start off sort of heading south, okay, but as the wind changes, you have to sort of go further and further around onto closer to the wind, and then there comes a point where you have to tack, and then you finish the voyage with only about 35 knots of breeze apparently. But that's a routing algorithm. obviously wouldn't actually do this, but it's really, really nice, you know, if you're going sailing across the channel, to have some sort of idea before you set out whereabouts you're going to have to tack. Here's an example of one of the Biscay ones that I did, which is, this is February 2021. And that was a weather window that was available in February to sail quite happily across Biscay. It would be a bit lumpy, but it was, you know, not particularly dangerous by being able to ingest the NWP data from the model directly into an app on a tablet and proceed across Biscay. So, going back to the start, Chichester, he just had climatology. And that's really, you know, in the days when I was at sea, that's really all we had as well. I mean, if you were going on the North Atlantic in January, you just go, oh dear, it's going to be lumpy. And that would be about, you know, what you could say. But now, people like Pip Hare, who's our sort of top British lady sailor now, who'll be in the Vendée Globe, she has access to all this kind of stuff. And so these guys are just racing around the world now. They're actually looking for wind and finding it using these kind of apps. So it's certainly moved on a bit since Chichester's day. So model weather forecasting works, and that's how it works. So hopefully there's some stuff in there you didn't know about, but a bit of an inside look into it all.
Are you prepared to take any questions?
Yeah, a few easy questions, yes.
Easy questions. So any person's got questions to ask?
Andrew, where I live, one of the best forms of forecasting is now forecasting.
Yes.
And you haven't mentioned that once.
No, I haven't. I worked for the guy who actually invented that term. Nowcasting, he called it. Keith Browning, his name was.
As long as you can see 12 miles in
yeah,
the direction.
Exactly. That's right. But that's not very helpful if you're, say, taking off from Heathrow to fly to Baltimore. Yeah. So yeah, having local knowledge is really, really important in weather forecasting, and that's why until relatively recently there were always local people, you know, and there still are at airfields and military airfields and that sort of thing.
Just as an interesting point, I think 2 or 3 days ago I read the obituary of the lady who took or gave the D-Day landings a tick.
Oh,
she
right.
was on the west coast of Ireland and she died at the age of 101.
Oh, right.
She was
Post office employee and
Yeah.
the post office
Ah,
on the
okay.
coast on weather forecast.
Yeah.
That's why they counted today.
Yeah.
Yes, her figure was that
Yeah.
this very big gale was coming.
Because she was upwind.
She then said the next day, oh, the wind's dropped.
Yeah.
That was enough to...
Yeah.
to the right direction.
Well, that's the first rule of weather forecasting. First rule of weather forecasting is everything moves from left to right. And the second rule is sometimes it moves from right to left. And the third is it's always raining in Wales. But anyway, don't use that one too much, it upsets some people.
Right, anybody else got a question? Keith?
And actually, given that the Met Office and these other big institutions have these massive supercomputers,
Yeah. Which they're not going to need.
sorry,
Which they're not going to need with AI
I was
coming
gonna
up.
say, how are these forecasting bodies managing to add so much value to the basic product?
Just by doing better and better science. The forecasts are getting more accurate, and you can see that year by year. And there are just an enormous number of scientists working on it, all sorts of different groups working on different aspects of it.
So the likes of Windy are employing better.
No, Windy are just using the output from these models. They're not doing any meteorology.
Okay, so that was really my question.
Yeah.
How are these models adding value in producing a better product than the Met Office?
So that I wouldn't say it's better. I mean, the science is fairly standard now, but the way in which it's used in the models, I guess, varies from place to place. What do you? I wasn't suggesting that the Met Office, ECMWF over a long period of time will come out better than the Met Office.
No, I
But
understood that. I mean, they're the data
yeah,
providers to these
Yeah.
other organisations who put a front end on it.
yeah, that's right.
Sorry, wasn't the implication that these front ends were producing a better product?
Right. Well, it's giving you information in a better form. Windy was actually started by a Czech guy who was a billionaire because he invented the equivalent of Google in the language there, which was difficult, I would think, for Google. And he made a lot of money very quickly, and he liked hang gliding, so he got some of his tech people to help him with his hang gliding. That's how that started. And it's just grown and grown and grown. but that's being used. You'll see people using that in Exeter because it's better than some of the stuff they've got. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. But all they're doing is presenting the data that's come from other people, and they're integrating other stuff as well. They've got webcams and all sorts of other stuff as well. So it's really just an IT project. And the value, I think, is in the fact that you can look at a very large amount of data very quickly. For example, I mean, if we spend hours looking at Windy, but if you have the premium service, right, you pay like €12 a year or something, you can actually go 10 days ahead, and you can also look at all the different models. So you can press a button, and you can go to Plymouth, and you can see what all the different models are saying for Plymouth 3 days ahead, and you'll find there's some variation. And what that will tell you is, yeah, there is some uncertainty, and you can then, make a decision based on the level of uncertainty that you can see in front of you. So that's a big way of adding value, is being able to establish the uncertainty, which is true of anything in life, isn't it?
Back to the end user making a judgment.
Yeah, that's right. But you're doing it based on with more information. If you've only got one weather forecast, what else can you do? But if you've got a whole range of weather forecasts, okay, you've got to do a bit more work, but at least you're a bit more in control of things. It's certainly important to the cruising sailor where the risk is higher. On a big ship, you can pretty much deal with anything. It might affect your operations and that, but in terms of safety, you're generally going to be okay. But if you're on a small boat, it enables you to assess the risk much more accurately.
Well, thank you, Andrew. There are other questions, I think, coming up, but I think we're on a time link, are we? In terms of...
No, I've got some from online.
You got some from online?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
On that very point, if I could just say locally, Captain Hone here sailed across the channel with me, didn't you? Do you remember that? From Brittany. Yes, we came. Bob very kindly changed his holiday plans in order to sail back with me, because my wife won't. She took the ferry, and we were sailing back from Brest through the Chanel de Four to Plymouth. And because Bob had changed his holiday plans, I wanted to make sure we had a decent sort of sail. And if you know the Chanel de Four, if you're going through in a yacht, you have to go through at the right time because you can't sail against the tide. And I was looking at the weather was quite complex. There were two little lows coming up, weren't there? And I was using all the stuff I'd got, and I actually used those American charts as well, the probability charts. And I reckoned that we could do it, but we had to go through at midnight. Remember that? Yeah, we went through the Chanel 4 at midnight, which is great because you can't see the rocks in the dark. And we had a lovely breakfast, didn't we? Although you didn't enjoy the breakfast too much.
I gather we have one or two questions from the online.
Crazy. So I've got a question from Nathan Monk. Do you anticipate that countries will start to modify the weather, for example, in wartime situations? Questions based on reports of China modification of weather for the Olympics.
That's interesting, isn't it? I'm going to this conference next week. It's the biggest weather conference in the world. There'll be thousands of people there. There were about 6,000 at the last one, and I think there are going to be even more at this one. And there is a whole section on weather modification and inadvertent weather modification. So I'm not an expert in that area, but it's certainly getting a lot of attention. There's a whole conference session the week after next about that. So it's certainly recognised as risk.
Yeah, and one from Nick Williams. With shipping transitioning to sails and kites to help decarbonise, are we expecting to see larger area, high accuracy forecasting for detailed route planning, e.g. Arome level coverage?
Arome, that's the French model. I showed you those two charts with the GFS around Plymouth Sound and the more detailed one. That is the French Arome model. So that is like the WRF model. It's like a high resolution, short grid length model run inside a global model. So that's all possible, certainly. And there's a lot of work being done on wind energy forecasting, because that's also of very great interest. And the Mediterranean is one of the areas where climate change is happening more quickly than anywhere else, actually. Very concerned about drought there, and there's also a lot of discussion about the future wind availability for wind farms. So yes, it's an area that's getting a lot of attention. Not by me, but I can see scientists working on that sort of thing.
So, just so you know, there's over 20 people online who are from all different areas, so great turnout online. That's the questions from online.
Thank you very much. Anybody else in the gentleman in the right?
So when I'm doing my
comparison between XC weather and
Yeah.
the Met Office, one of the things I've tended to find is XC weather tends to be a little bit lower and a little bit closer to what you see for wind strength when you're just going that closely. But in particular, the gusts are reported as low and it tends to tally more. Is that purely a model difference, or does the Met Office have to err on the side of caution?
I can't say that the Met Office will be using a short grid length model for local forecast. If you're using, I always use the Met Office local website when I go sailing, because I know that that is the highest resolution model, and it's a very good quality model, and it's likely to be more accurate than the GFS model. And if that's what, it's very important to get used to a particular forecast product and make your own assessment of that against what you see for real. But weather forecast accuracy is a very difficult thing to measure. Actually, I used to negotiate TV weather contracts, both for my own company and also a telecoms company I worked with, and it's really interesting how a client weather forecast will often ask for a clause in the contract that says that you get your money, they get their money back if you do a wrong forecast, and you have to have a conversation about that, because it's just not possible to do that, because everybody's understanding of accuracy varies enormously. I mean, for example, a sailor is really only interested in the wind, but doesn't really care whether it's raining or not. It's nice if it isn't, but it doesn't really matter. And if you're going for a picnic, you're more interested in the sunshine. So how do you determine that sort of accuracy? And another interesting sort of sociological point, I was working for a big telecoms company, and there was a weather contract, and there were also contracts for horoscopes. And there was no discussion whatsoever about an accuracy clause in the contract for a horoscope. The negotiating points were totally about the name that was associated, because there were various names that are associated, and also the cut of the premium rate phone call. So that's again a perception of accuracy, which it wasn't even discussed there. But in weather, everyone wants to talk about it. But in fact, there are whole conferences that are run about accuracy of weather, and there are huge differences. Ice formation on roads, for example, the cost of not gritting a motorway when it should have been gritted is very different to gritting it unnecessarily. In one, you waste salt, in the other, people die, and that's so it's very, very difficult. So not a straight answer.
Just on that, how do you measure accuracy? Is it a physical process?
Well, me personally.
Well, no, you say these models are more accurate.
Yeah.
How do you know?
Well, those are independent views where people will take a particular parameter. I mean, if you're a meteorologist, you won't actually look at the surface, because what's happening at the surface is always driven by something at loft, and you probably do something like 850 millibars, which doesn't really mean anything to us, but it's a sort of conservative property. If you can get it right there.
So you're not checking the accuracy, you just say you've got high accuracy.
Well, no, yes, but
No, yes.
yeah, no, it's. I'll explain. That what you do is a reanalysis. So after the event, you then go back.
When we checked it live, you say the pressure's going to be 1,010.
Yeah.
There's nobody out there with a biograph going, actually, it's 1,011. That model is wrong.
Well, the models are being run continuously. So you will do a forecast for, say, the following day, based on your data assimilation from the current day, and then when you get to the forecast the previous day, you'll actually be able to look back.
So who does the looking back then?
Well, the organisations themselves will do that. Then people will also do it. They would. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Who does it?
Well, ECMWF does it, but there are also independent people who do that as well.
We had another
Well, there's a whole range of people. Anybody can do it because the data is publicly available.
We've got
So-
another couple of questions from the floor. Gentleman at the back.
Just following on from what you were saying about gritted when I'm
Yes. Yeah.
when you miss it.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of like safety factor involved in
Yeah.
monitoring whether we're taking a more pessimistic approach if there's
Yeah.
danger?
Absolutely. Back in the 87-ish, the company I had was actually producing, there was a system called Open Road run by the Met Office, which integrated thermal mapping of road networks with a numerical model that forecast the road surface temperature, and in situ measurements by sensors actually buried in the motorways. And the model that we had was produced by the University of Birmingham, and the graphs that we put in front of the people at the gritting depots actually had two lines, which were optimistic and pessimistic. So there was and sometimes those lines were quite close together, sometimes they're a long way apart, and that's now 30 or more years ago. So that idea is very much around, but it has to be tailored for the particular situation. And that was something that I learned about by talking to people actually who were driving the lorries and managing those fleets, and they said it's actually, if we put down too much grit, it's a shame for all the hedgehogs and that they get by the roadside. But if we don't do enough, that's a different sort of problem altogether.
One last question, I think, from you.
Do you think the government-run forecasts like Nautical, STCW, do you think they'll converge to be the same in time? So like if ECMWF is the best right now, when we be able to figure out differences in observational inputs and stuff?
No, I think it's a good thing that there are different groups working independently on the same problem. And they all learn from each other. That's why we have these conferences. The European conference, which is in Barcelona this year, there will be hundreds of people from all over the world there. The one that's happening next week in America, there will be thousands of people from all over the world. People from China, probably people from Russia as well. Who knows? I don't know. Maybe probably not in America, but anyway. So there are people all over the world, all talking about the same stuff, and it's a sort of international competition in a way. And I guess everybody wants theirs to be the best, but I mean everybody agrees that the ECMWF model is the best at the moment. But I don't think that there would be just one model. Actually, one of the biggest threats to all this is the fact that organisations like Google and Amazon are actually elbowing their way in on this. Amazon now actually employ a meteorologist. I know because I've spoken to him, and it's kind of slightly scary because their view of the market is very different to other people, and they want a mass sort of public market. They're not offering tailored services which are specialised for gritting roads. I mean, I don't think Amazon are going to produce a service for people who need to decide whether to go and grit the M5 or not. And if they muscle in to such an extent that the companies that can do that kind of thing are put out of business, then we'll lose that. So there's a lot of moving parts in it. Sorry, rather complicated answer to...
Well, I think we'll draw it to a close there. I'm sure Andrew will be available to have a chat with him afterwards. Jeff, have you anything to say to your colleagues in the IMRS arena?
Well, we're still working on the next meeting in February. But we'll be sending out the flyer soon, I hope.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So on behalf of us all, Andrew, I just wish to thank you for an interesting talk. I can only remember in the 1970s when I was at university, we did have a talk on meteorology. It was very posh. It was one of these big spectacles, and the meteorologist who spoke there was a chap called Bert Ford. Some older members might remember him, but he always said that actually before he actually went on site on the television, he actually would phone up half a dozen farmers around the country and ask them what they thought. And then, he would actually make his proclamation about what the forecast would be. So it's a combination, isn't it, really, of technology and, in fact, sort of experience, which goes together to make, in fact, our meteorological sort of information as valuable as it is. And it is, and I agree with you, the information as a sort of...
All I would say to that, it's okay if he's talking to people sitting at home, but if it was a pilot on about to fly out of Heathrow to the east coast of the States, he wouldn't really be interested in what the farmers are saying.
No, he probably wouldn't. But anyway,
he'd want to know what's happening at 39,000 feet.
It has made tremendous strides, as I really think, in the 50 years which has intervened. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I don't know if there's any stuff to be eaten up, but please let those boxes go back empty rather than anything in them. And we'll see you at our next session. Thank you very much.